Manager, you want to lay out the land development code?
Sure. Mayor, Council, put this on the work session agenda today to simply provide an overview of the memo that was distributed on March 15th. I know that since the last work session where I teed this up of saying that this is my recommendation for the initial first step of doing the land development code rewrite after the August 2018 resolution. I know that spring break we've had spring break since then, and South by Southwest, and so the purpose of today's briefing is simply to provide an overview for everyone to be on the same page about what is in this memo and what's not in the memo. But for those that may have been paying attention, or for those that are just seeing this for the first time, it's really important to get everyone on the same page. So I've asked Rodney Gonzalez, Assistant City Manager, and Brent Lloyd to walk us through that memo. But I just wanted to thank everyone for their patience as we gathered information. I want to thank the community for input on really thinking about what has worked well and maybe what could be improved since the last process. And it continues to be my recommendation to the council that this is the first step that we need to take in the land development code rewrite. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Assistant City Manager Rodney Gonzalez.
Thank you, City Manager. Rodney Gonzalez, Assistant City Manager for Economic Opportunity and Affordability. Before I get started, I just wanted to say thanks to the staff that was involved in the policy guidance document. Brent Lloyd to my right-hand side, who recently transitioned to Development Services Department. Jessica King, Erica Lopez, Greg Dutton, Lacey Patterson, Laura Keating, and Lindy Garwood. Mayor and Council, as the City Manager had mentioned, the policy guidance encompasses the most prominent questions that we've seen, we've heard, and they surround issues and concerns that were discussed among the staff, community, boards and commissions, and Council yourselves. The list of questions within the policy guide focus on housing capacity, missing middle housing, compatibility standards, and parking, which are all central to the Land Development Code. As the City Manager mentioned, we're here today to provide a very high-level overview of the policy guidance document, and at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Brent Lloyd.
Thanks. Good morning, Mayor and Council. Brent Lloyd here today in my role as Development Officer for DSD and member of the staff team that Rodney just introduced. On behalf of the team, I'm going to provide an overview of the manager's memo, which is titled Matter-of-Factly Land Development Code Revision Policy Guidance. I'm going to offer some additional context for you all to consider. The memo represents kind of a new approach to moving forward with the code revision, and we want you to understand the thinking behind the various options that are presented, as well as general suggestions for next steps. Staff will be available to answer some questions if you have any, but our goal for today is definitely to keep this briefing at a fairly high level. The item can be posted on future agendas for more focused discussion as well as potential action. The memo that's before you, and I think was passed out, is posted on the internet, and it was issued on March 15th. And we have extras available as well for anyone in the audience that would like a copy. Before we dive in, I just want to say a few words about what the memo is intended to do, as well as what it's not intended to do. First and foremost, the memo is meant to help you set the direction for the code revision going forward. It does that by breaking down key issues for your consideration and suggesting a range of options for addressing each issue. Getting your direction on all these topics will help better focus staff's effort at code development, and it will increase the chances that the new process results in a code which meets your goals and objectives. The memo is also intended more simply to provide a way for everyone to get started again, and that includes council, staff, as well as members of the public, and to really help us re-engage in the hard work of revising the city's land development code. It's been 6 months since the prior effort was brought to its conclusion, and the team, with the manager's leadership, felt that the topics covered in the memo will help refocus our attention on the land development code overall and provide a meaningful transition between the last process and the new one. All that said, the memo is just a memo. It's not intended to limit council's direction now at this initial stage or in the future when an ordinance is eventually presented for your consideration. The options provided are reference points for you to consider and can easily be expanded or modified to include additional clarification. So with that context in mind, I just want to dive in and provide an overview of the memo. And I think a good place to start for those of you that are referring to the document would be the list of questions that are set forth at pages 2 through 3 of the memo. Each of these questions is accompanied by an appendices that provides additional background information, planning options, and data. As the manager notes in the introduction to the memo, the questions selected are drivers for many of the code requirements that are featured prominently in the Land Development Code. For that reason, getting some direction on these questions will add significant value to the code drafting process. It'll help to focus staff's efforts, as I mentioned, and ensure that the next iteration of the code better meets council's objectives and goals. It's important to note that the questions are not an exhaustive list. The Land Development Code is about much more than parking, compatibility standards, or even housing types. Going forward, whichever option council chooses in terms of the overall scope, other policy questions will arise. There will be other issues that need to be discussed. But these issues that are listed at pages 3 through 4 were very prominent aspects of the debate surrounding the prior effort. And we felt that they, again, getting direction on these questions would provide strong guidance for the revision process going forward. So the first question is an overall scope question. It's the one question that doesn't relate to a specific regulatory topic. And just to read the question, to what extent should the Land Development Code be revised? And there are different options for that. Option A, adopt a new land development code. And that option can be broken down into really two separate ideas. One would be a new land development code text, the actual 2-volume document, as well as a zoning map that would implement the zoning districts that are set out in the text. And the two would take effect concurrently. The second option would be to adopt the text only and defer its effective date until council has time to do a more comprehensive and thorough zoning map analysis. That's an option that some cities have also pursued. I think both options have been used in different municipalities around the country when they're, undertaking a huge effort like what we're considering today. Option B is to adopt a more limited set of amendments to the existing land development code that would target improvements in one or more policy areas. As the memo sets forth, there are definitely pros and cons to each option. The more significantly council wants to change the land development code, the more structural sorts of revisions you all want to make by breaking open zoning districts, creating new zoning districts, establishing new procedures by which applications are considered and reviewed. The more you go in that direction, the harder it is to just do limited amendments. The more those changes have ripple effects throughout the code that really would necessitate so many amendments to individual sections that it becomes very difficult not to simply adopt a new document. But certainly if council wanted to just focus on a particular area, parking, compatibility standards, housing types, certainly that would lend itself to a more focused and narrow effort. For now, at this stage, at this transition stage, the manager has chosen to limit the recommendations to just this question. And the recommendation is that we stay the course with adopting a new code. The new code, as touched on in the memo, the idea of adopting a new code is driven by more than just concerns about the individual policy areas. It's driven by concerns that were identified in the 2014 Land Development Code Diagnosis Report that outline many ways in which our code has become unwieldy over time. It has a lot of provisions that conflict provisions that don't necessarily reflect practices as they exist today, and provisions that are unclear and that have created, problems for staff as well as the community. So staff has suggested that we stay the course with adopting a new code, but we want you all to have a chance to revisit that question. It was a question that was brought up, throughout the prior process, and we wanted to lay out all the options. And going forward, we'll be available to discuss, the nuances of each one in more detail. So the remaining questions, 2 through 5, are really the regulatory policy questions, and I think they are the heart of the memo. And I want to thank again the PAS team that Director Greg Guernsey made available to work on this memo, and all the effort that they put into helping to frame the issues and provide what we felt was the most relevant background for each one. And before we just kind of go through each question, I want to talk about the options. We presented for each of these questions 3 different options. And those options are broken down into option A, which is essentially to maintain the level of regulatory protections that are afforded by the current land development code. Option B, which is to, generally shoot for the same kind of changes that were implemented through draft 3 of the prior of Code Next. And option C, which is to go further than draft 3 did in terms of potentially tools that would further increase housing supply and go in a expanded direction towards the goals that the draft 3 document sought to achieve. These options are not meant to limit your discretion, and each of the options, I think, is amenable to additional clarification by council. For example, option A, which is to maintain the level of protection afforded by current code, that need not be read as an endorsement of the status quo. Option A could easily be accompanied by direction that the city do further planning to look at potential enhancements going forward. Option B, the draft 3 effort, likewise need not be read as necessarily a full endorsement of the Code Next document. I think everybody in the memo emphasizes this, have acknowledged that draft 3 needs revisions, a lot of revisions, even apart from the questions that are before you today. A lot of changes and corrections were identified during the public process. And if council goes with option B, the draft 3 option on a particular question, you could certainly include some clarification that highlights the things you liked about draft 3 and the things you didn't like. Option C, which we're referring to as the expanded option, likewise lends itself to further direction from you all. The memo, in drawing upon the different choices that are suggested for option C, identifies recommendations that the Planning Commission made, as well as, in a few cases, ideas that council itself proposed through various resolutions over the years. If you go with option C for a particular policy question, you can certainly choose to identify particular measures that you would like to have considered, as well as identify other measures that maybe you're not interested in pursuing at this time. And the report under option C tries to give you some ideas, tries to identify specific measures that have been discussed and debated in the community during the prior effort. So with that, we'll just briefly go through the particular policy questions, starting with the regulatory questions that are 2 through 5. So housing capacity. To what extent should the land, this is question 2 at page 11, to what extent should the Land Development Code provide for additional housing capacity in order to achieve the 135,000 additional units recommended by the Strategic Housing Blueprint? And those options, again, making use of the structure that I just described, are to option A, maintain for the level of housing capacity that's established in the current code, which is approximately 145,000 units. provide a level of capacity that's comparable to Draft 3, or provide greater housing capacity than Draft 3 through some of the enhanced measures that are discussed in the memo. Housing capacity is not a science. It's more of an art. And as you all know from the prior discussion and debate around Draft 3, setting that number definitely requires a lot of careful thinking. The core idea behind housing capacity that I think staff has tried to set forth in the appendices is that market forces will often prevent properties from redeveloping or adding additional housing. So the more properties that are available that have the entitlements to provide housing, the more likely the stars are to align to actually get development that produces additional housing capacity. But again, that is not a science. There's not a magic number. There's not an algorithm. It takes careful judgment, careful planning, and as well as consideration of other goals. Housing capacity is affected by a lot of things. The other questions that follow question 2, the missing middle housing question, the parking question, and the compatibility standards question, all those, your decision on how to tackle those questions also have the potential to very directly affect housing capacity. But housing capacity is broader than that in the sense that this question, the options that are provided for this question also include potential map changes. One of the issues that was discussed in the prior process was the extent to which a new zoning map, if you choose to continue with adoption of a new zoning map, the extent to which the map should apply new zones right out of the gate, or whether it should use a placeholder zoning category that maintains the status quo temporarily for some areas of the city, to then be changed through a rezoning process later on when fuller planning can be considered. And that the choices that are made with respect to mapping also will affect housing capacity. This third question, and I guess just very briefly, the options that are suggested for the expanded option, which is option C, include some very basic measures that sort of percolated to the top of the discussion during the prior effort. Those include increasing by right entitlements that are available administratively without necessarily participation in any sort of discretionary approval process. The second, and these are outlined at page 15. A second would be to further expand the density bonus program. Draft 3 made considerable efforts to proceed with expansions of the density program, and you all are considering additional options through the resolution called Affordability Unlocked. But certainly, folding that effort into the code rewrite or pursuing new measures along those lines is definitely an option for this question. Changes to non-zoning regulations. During the discussion around Draft 3, many stakeholders pointed out that even if your zoning entitlements appear to allow a particular level of density or housing capacity, there are times where other regulations, drainage regulations, watershed regulations, parkland dedication regulations, may have the impact of preventing people from achieving that level of capacity. And so it was suggested through, I think, motions that the Planning Commission voted on, as well as at least one other measure that Council suggested through a resolution. It was suggested that we really look at how those other non-zoning regulations interplay with zoning regulations. If Council chose to, and I think page 16 of the memo kind of goes through some of those options more specifically, but if Council chose to endorse this option, staff would have to do some hard work. Staff would have to work with other departments and carefully consider kind of what the impact of relaxing some of those standards would have on other important goals for the city. So should Council choose to direct staff to consider some of the options that are outlined at page 16, Staff would not necessarily come back with all of them. Staff would not necessarily come back with a proposal that, substantially reduces all of these regulations. It would definitely require some interdepartmental review and coordination. But we definitely think there is opportunity with each of these areas to make some targeted and tailored changes that would have the effect of letting people get closer to the maximum capacity allowed by the zoning regulations. And as I previously mentioned, all of the other options, all of the other questions, missing middle housing, compatibility standards, and parking also have the potential to affect housing capacity. So let's transition now to policy question 3, which begins at page 19. And this question is basically, to what extent should the Land Development Code encourage more missing middle housing types, such as duplexes, multiplexes, townhomes, cottage courts, and accessory dwelling units? And the options available include maintaining the range of housing types provided for by the current Land Development Code, provide for a range of types that are comparable to Draft 3, or provide for a greater range of housing types than were offered in Draft 3. Draft 3 included what I believe planning staff feel like were fairly modest enhancements to the range of housing types that are available relative to current code. And there are certainly, a great deal of different housing types that are allowed under current code as well. So the options available to you, again, are really to sort of preserve the range of housing types that are already available under current code, to go the Draft 3 route. And beginning at page 21, it kind of outlines the ways that Draft 3 of Code Next sought to increase housing types. And then the third option, again, is to pursue some further expansions that would go further along the lines that Draft 3 sought to pursue in terms of opening up further opportunities for different housing types. And those options include mapping new transition areas, further reducing barriers to missing middle housing. Compatibility standards. And that's question 4, and that starts at page 25. Compatibility standards are an important part of the city's code, and they've been in the code, I think, since 1981. And they're intended as the original findings for the ordinance adopting compatibility standards specified to protect single-family neighborhoods from the impacts of adjacent commercial and industrial development. There is some indication in the record of sort of development that's occurred in the city that compatibility standards may have impacts on housing capacity, and that compatibility standards can at times create a certain level of uncertainty. Unlike most regulations, compatibility standards are not triggered solely by how a property is zoned, but they're triggered by by how adjacent properties are actually being used. There were a number of options considered in Draft 3 for sort of attempting to moderate the impact of compatibility standards on housing capacity, and those options are set forth in the memo. Other options for sort of going further in terms of reducing the impact of compatibility standards would include having the regulations really be structured in a more traditional way, in the sense that they would be triggered by the zoning of a property rather than how a property happens to be being used. The goals of compatibility standards, as staff has outlined in the memo, are also things that can be furthered through more careful mapping of transitionary zones along corridors and adjacent to neighborhoods that are the most likely to be impacted by commercial uses. Compatibility standards, everybody recognizes, serve important goals, and they're an important part of the code, and it's not an easy issue to address, but I think planning staff has done their very best to kind of outline the pros and cons and the trade-offs that sort of attached to each of the three options presented. Parking requirements, and this is the last of our regulatory questions to touch on, and then we'll open it up for questions. The question set forth at page 32, to what extent should the city's minimum parking requirements be modified to provide additional opportunities for development or encourage transit options consistent with Imagine Austin? And the options, again, are to maintain the parking requirements that are comparable to current code, reduce the impact of minimum parking requirements in a manner similar to what Draft 3 sought to do, and then finally go further in the direction of reducing minimum parking requirements. This is a fairly basic and I think easy to understand issue. Parking provides important benefits. People have to park, and as much as the city, through its various planning efforts, wants to incentivize and move further in a direction of not being dependent upon cars and of emphasizing transit, people still have to drive, and parking is an important value, and the regulations serve to try to ensure that sufficient opportunities to park is available. But it also has impacts. It has impacts on walkability, it has impacts on the viability of transit, and it has impacts potentially as well on housing capacity. So the document, starting at page 33 and going through towards the end of the document at page 39, just kind of gives you an overall summary of what our current code does with respect to parking, how Draft 3 sought to, make some targeted reductions to minimum parking requirements, and then the options that are available for sort of further expanding the scope of parking reductions that were afforded by Draft 3. So those are my comments regarding the memo. We hope it's a useful document, and we hope it provides a good transition into the next phase of this process of revising our land development code. Again, planning staff are available potentially to answer some questions, and we'll open it up for questions, but we definitely, we're here to talk at a high level. The manager has indicated that this can be an item on future work session agendas, and we anticipate further, more focused discussion will occur in the near future.
So just as a real quick housekeeping, we received a 2-page memorandum today, and then the document goes from pages 1 to page 37. So there's not a 38 and 39 in case anybody looks for that.
I apologize.
Not a problem. Just want to make that in case anybody was trying to follow along. So, Manager, you want to address this?
Sure. Again, really thanks staff for that overview. The goal today was simply to provide that overview for both the council and for the community. That was a lot to take in, but as Brent said, just moving forward with what that appropriate next step is from where we left things in August. I really feel that, as I said in the last work session, that providing some additional policy guidance before we can even develop the kind of work team, if you will, the project team, even what are the next steps in the process, this is the first step in determining what that would be. So I look forward to this continued dialogue. Again, I anticipate, with council's agreement, putting this on the work session agenda on subsequent meetings and also on the council agenda. So not only if you're prepared to or ready to vote on any of these questions, but also allowing the public to weigh in, because that agenda item could be pulled and individuals could speak on it at that time as well. So with that, if there are any clarifying questions, that would certainly be welcome.
Councilmember Kitchen.
I wanted to just, first off, thank you all for this. I know it was quite a bit of effort to put together, so I appreciate that. And thank you, City Manager. So I wanted to stay on the process question for a minute. I think it would be helpful at some point when the council is ready for us to lay out in a little bit more detail how we want to proceed to address policy questions. And what I mean there exactly is I'm wanting to make sure that the public understands on what days we are actually going to take this up, and also whether we want to consider a process where we say at X council meeting we will do a public hearing, and at Y council meeting we'll vote. Or some, I don't have a preconceived idea about how that happens. I just think that laying out those near-term expectations in terms of how we'll handle the policy would be very helpful for people, both for the public to understand how they should proceed and what days they should be talking with us publicly in a hearing, and how we will understand what to expect. So at whatever the right time is, I think we should have that conversation. In my mind, I think that I'm wanting to move relatively quickly. So, so I might propose, I just want to give you a concrete example. I'm not set on this, but just to give you a concrete example. So we might say on our April 11th council meeting, we're going to have public testimony. And we might say we'll then vote on April 25th or whatever it is. Or we may set other dates. Or we may say this is such this is an important topic that we want people to have enough time that they're not speaking to us at 10 o'clock at night. We might say, well, maybe we just need to set aside a day, although I know that's always a problem. But anyway, I just think we need to be real clear on when we're going to hear from people and how our process is going to allow to hear from people and then vote. So
I think that is worthy of discussing, so that we kind of lay that out. Just to throw an idea out there too for folks to consider. The manager had said, putting it on the agenda at the work sessions and at the council meetings in April. That makes sense to me too. Since we obviously haven't discussed this was just given out, my hope is that people might go to the message board now in response to this, even before we would gather on the 11th. That might give us a feel for where some people are thinking. But maybe in order for me to feel comfortable answering that question, I'd like to hear back from people first, because I don't have a feel for where collectively we are. But I could see us at the meeting on April 11th, after people have weighed in or after the community has spoken to us, answering those kind of scheduling questions on the 11th. But as a default, thinking about putting it on the agendas for the 9th and the 11th for the work session, for the two meetings in April, and then at that first work session or that first week, we could then say, okay, this is where we are. That's what I think I would propose. Councilmember Flanagan and Councilmember Tova.
Manager, remind me when this memo went out, because we didn't get it today. We got it 2 weeks ago, was it?
Yep, on March 15th.
March 15th. So my hope is that we can actually have that discussion now, Mayor, because I think we've had time to kind of contemplate what the memo says. I think Councilmember Kitchen has a good kind of first idea, is to say have this on the agenda for the first meeting in April as an opportunity for deliberation and public testimony, kind of like a first reading situation as we might do on an ordinance, even though I think it would probably take the form of a resolution. And then for hearing the public testimony on the first meeting in April, maybe doing some initial amendments, just getting a sense based on that testimony, and then adopting it at the second meeting in April to formally kick off the staff process with the policy direction. And I think I'm certainly prepared to have us do that work in the month of April and get this into the drafting process as soon as possible.
Yeah, as we continue to talk about a timeline, I think it's important that we not be voting on the same day that we're having public testimony for the first time, and that seemed to be unclear in our conversations about April 11th, which would be our first day to have public testimony.
Greg.
Mayor, I hadn't thought exactly about timeline, but the way that Councilmember Flanagan and Councilmember Kitchen and yourself sort of laid out that we could have testimony one day and then dedicate another day to trying to have a final vote makes a lot of sense to me. I For me, the questions around timeline and scope and the policy issues are intertwined, and public testimony. All those things to me kind of fit together as one. We have been hearing many of the same things for years now, right? Imagine Austin was passed, I think, back in 2012. So we can't wait another 6 or 7 years to address the things that people were bringing up then and bring up constantly to us that need to be addressed. The help that we can provide addressing housing costs, the help that we can provide addressing environmental damage, what we can do to help people get to childcare or to their job more easily. We have to do what it is that we can this year, understanding that we might not be able to get absolutely every single thing done perfectly all within a single year. My answers to the policy questions generally, and of course I'm open to hearing from the public more and working with our colleagues, and I know it's going to take time, but my answers generally are that we have to take concrete steps in 2019 to address those issues, because we've heard from folks so often and so long that they want, not that they want to see government work slower, but that they want to see us address their problems as quickly as we can. And so whatever it is that we can do in 2019, votes that we can take that actually map changes in 2019 to address the key issues that the manager has laid out in the memo is really important to me. So I don't want to spend so much time trying to figure out exactly the right housing capacity such that we're in 2020 or 2021 or 2022, and then we've missed out on addressing the housing needs because we've taken so much longer. The environmental damage caused by sprawl and displacement caused by us not meeting our housing goals continue to happen. And so the more that we can try to get something significant done for the community in 2019, I think is really critical. And I think to stay on that kind of a timeline, I do want to try to hold ourselves to getting a vote out to the staff in April that answers A, B, or C to each of those questions as you've asked, Manager, and then provide some additional direction. I like the idea of on the message board sort of trying to hash out what that concise direction could be so that staff knows what it is that we want, and so that staff can be successful in bringing us something back, and then we can work thoughtfully and deliberately across our districts to get to the end goal. But to me, so many of my answers will flow from the public input we've had and the strategic planning that we have already done. With the strategic housing blueprint, we know our housing capacity doesn't get us to the goals in our blueprint, and people will be displaced and our city will become more exclusive if we don't get there. We know that the missing middle goals we've set as a council are 30% of our new housing should be of a housing type that is more accessible to more kinds of people. We know our current code and even code next draft 3, we're not doing that well. And then with our mobility plan and our mobility metrics we've set, we know that we can't get there with what it is we have now. And if we want to do a big transit investment and have great transit planning, we should make sure we have a land development code that at least is pointing in that direction. And so for me, I think we need to make bold steps to help our community quickly, but then not drag it out such that we're actually hurting our own cause because we're trying to get absolutely every piece done absolutely right in a single year. We have to just do our very best, I think, this year. So I'm ready to answer your questions as you've laid them out, probably provide some additional direction, and know that my answers on compatibility and parking and other places flow from the planning that we've already done and the things we have heard about protecting our environment, slowing displacement, making our community more affordable and accessible. And for us to do that, I think we have to move quickly and we have to listen to one another and continue to work with the community on it. So I don't think working fast means we aren't listening. I think it means that we are, and I continue to hear that we just need to do something. So, I'm good with that kind of a timeline, and I appreciate the memo. As you've put it out, you're forcing us to make choices, and I think putting those choices out there in our responses makes a lot of sense.
Allison.
Thank you. In preparing for today's conversation, I went back to a document that Mayor Adler and Councilmember Kitchen and I prepared back in February of 2018 that laid out some shared goals for the Land Development Code, and I wanted to share that again with my colleagues, particularly our new colleagues who may or may not have seen it. Because for me, this document still guides how I'm thinking about the Land Development Code, and I think there's value in us also recognizing where we do have common agreement. The memo is very much shaped to focus on the disagreement, and I think that in any situation where we're trying to solve a problem or address something, understanding and recognizing the common ground of where we're stating and the shared values is a useful place for us to be starting in terms of recognizing our shared goals and intentions. The choices before us, as presented in the memo, involve trade-offs. I believe that if we roll up our sleeves and we are willing to dive a bit into the nuances that are there that are not necessarily in how they've been presented, I think we can come up with some direction moving forward, and I'm committed to trying to do that. We have a lot of work ahead of us. I'm not sure whether the timetable that has been put forward by my colleagues is fully realistic, but I took it as an example of how we could move forward. But I do, I would ask that my colleagues maybe take a look again at that document, because I think it's really easy for us to feel like we don't agree, and I think we have come a long way in terms of things that we do agree on, and there are pieces of it that are not part of, say, the questions that are before us that set us in the right direction for making the revisions for the code that we would do well to remember. So, for instance, I think there's pretty broad agreement that we want to have more residential options within commercial things, and there are a lot of places where there are broad agreements that would take us in a direction of a code that will allow us to reach our goals. So that's what I want to share today.
Dahlia?
I think it's important to have the discussion now and as soon as possible, and I think I like I hadn't actually thought about that. Thank you for bringing that up, Councilmember Kitchen. I think I like that plan, having some public hearing on the first April council meeting and then taking these votes. I too am ready to vote on this. I appreciate the way that it has been laid out. I'm looking at the team. I really like the team that you've put together, and I really like that there's a lawyer explaining those nuances and helping us understand those.
Non-practicing.
Okay, non-practicing. I think once you go to law school, your life is changed forever. There's so much gray in the world.
Stuck,
Yeah. I agree that it will be hard to do this in a year, but I think it's important that we do as much as possible this year. There has been a lot of work, a lot of community engagement, and I think we can build on that. And every time we talk to our constituents, they give us examples that are, displacement examples, gentrification, affordability issues, and they're all giving examples based on the current code, based on the system that we are working with. And we have to change that. We have to, there's going to be trade-offs, and it's going to be really hard. I mean, this in a way reminds me of Connections 2025, when we revamped the things that we did at Cap Metro, and it was an extremely hard decision, and we took away some routes, we added some routes, but in the end, we're serving more people. Ridership is going up. I wasn't 100% happy with the way that worked out, but it was an important step in changing the way we serve our community and improving the quality of life and making sure that all types of people can continue to call Austin home. And so I'm 100% on board getting this done as quickly as possible, getting as much work done. It's going to be hard, but that's our job, to make those hard decisions and help Austinites.
So I like the process that you've set up here. I like the questions that came out. I think that one of the reasons why the process that we had before didn't move forward was because this council had ever given really basic direction, which meant that the range of possibilities that was being discussed in the community was I think overly broad. And my sense of the council is that we were in a closer band But we hadn't really given that measure of focus, I think, to the community or to staff. So I like doing that. I like coming back to the council to do that. And from a timing perspective, I would also, just if we're kind of building consensus or indicating on the dais, I too would like to see us get as much as we can get done this year. My hope is that a lot of next year we're focused on the mobility questions and trying to figure out what it would take to bring high capacity rapid transit to the city. And so I think it would be helpful to the degree that we can to be able to work through land development code issues. I like setting it on the agenda right now for the 2 meetings we have, both work sessions and general sessions. I'd be comfortable saying, let's have let the public know that they can comment at that Thursday on April 11th. If you take a look at the agenda and try and give us an agenda that would help support that, I think for me that would be good. I agree with Councilmember Tovo that there should not be an expectation that we're actually taking a vote on the 11th, because I think that this is a big enough thing, even these 5 questions, for us to take comment and actually have an expectation the community would be voting the same day. At the end of that, then, if it's on the agenda for the last 2 meetings in April, maybe it'll make more sense and we'll have a better feel at that point for what is appropriate at that point in time. But the default being to put it on the agenda for those those things that make sense. And I do like the idea of us communicating in the interim on message board postings to give people a sense of where we are, or what's going to be discussed or put at issue, or what people's thoughts or reactions are. Peel.
Yeah, Mayor, I mean, I'm willing to wait till the end of April, but we have had an election. We've already had people that said, listen, we need to start moving on this quickly. We realize that it's real critical problem that we're having about lack of affordable housing and housing the missing middle housing that we're having right now, and we need to address that issue very quickly. We're losing people. And when our firefighters and our teachers are having to move further out, you're going to have problems, because these teachers are going to say, why even bother coming all the way in? While we're passing all these other school districts, we can just work there. So we need to address this problem quickly, and I hope that, we really address that issue as soon as possible.
Leslie.
Well, I agree with a number of my colleagues around the dais who have weighed in about the timeline, and I'm really glad that Allison brought the document that you and Ann and Steve had written and given to us last year. It's especially helpful to remind us of where we were, and it's a good document for our 2 new colleagues to have a look at. So I think we have a lot of common ground. And I think there's good possibilities for a nuanced approach. I think that's what the community is looking for. There's lots of options laid out for us here, which is really good. So I'm looking forward to having the discussion, seeing the timeline, and having a discussion over the next few weeks and months.
Okay.
Thanks
Jimmy,
for this work.
Jimmy and then Ann.
So I would love to get into the policy stuff now, but I'm getting the sense that people are willing to do that later, which is fine. I have a long list of things I intend to talk about. But Mayor, just as a suggestion, maybe you can do the first post on the message board. That way 4 of us don't rush to make a post and then they're not organized into a single place. So maybe if you can do an initial post on the message board and we all can kind of fill in our thoughts on that underneath, just as a structure.
Okay. Let me think about that. Maybe it's something that I delegate to somebody else on the group, but something to kind of launch that, to give people a place to start. Sounds good. Thanks. Ann.
I have a related process question, so that City Manager, maybe you could speak to this. One of the things that I think is important for the public to understand is, so then what? Is that question of what's next. And I understand that we need some flexibility in terms of timelines and that kind of stuff, but I also understand that that we all are interested in moving as quickly as is appropriate to get through these things. So I wanted to, I understand that the goal is to get the policy direction from the, at least on these 5 issues before proceeding, but I do think that it's really important soon to lay out what are the expectations after that and what the timeline is after that and who our team is that's going to address that. So can you speak to what your thinking is about when and how the public can expect to see something like that?
Sure. Councilmember, I think that how I teed this up was really one step at a time, and some of those questions would be answered based on how you think and the decisions that are made by council. But that doesn't mean that some initial socializing, if you will, about what the next step could happen concurrently. And so as we have discussions at the next council work session and we hear testimony, I will think about if there's even some options I could be putting forward during the month of April. But again, I really can't make those determinations about any recommendations for process until at least there's some clarification about how these questions are answered.
Yeah, I guess what I would be thinking would be when we finish this process, whenever that is, I would then want to accompany that policy direction a pretty specific timeline for people so that people know what to expect. I'm talking about the public in general. So, for example, it could be something like, we take our votes on policy, we give policy direction, and then the next steps are that the code language will come back to us in, I hate to give you a month, but September, October, November, whatever it is, I think people need to understand that so that they know when they have an opportunity to come back and talk to us about specific language. Also, so that we have some understanding of really how the rest of the year can lay out. So that's what I'd be thinking. Great. And so is that what you...
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Mayor, I have one other thing. Does someone else want to speak first? Oh,
Hang on a second. Let's let Paige speak.
Sure. I just wanted to say I'm excited to participate in this process. I had to watch it from the sidelines before. But I'm so thankful for the work that you've put into this and your staff's putting into it. And I think there's already also a lot of good public involvement comment, and that because this has been a lengthy process previously, that it's good that we have something to see what did work, what didn't work, what our community stakeholders have already identified. And it's really nice to enter this process knowing that there's already been a really robust public involvement process. I like to see that as someone who used to do that professionally. But I also just want to mention that even over the past year, as half of us were campaigning, the number one issue was affordability. And we've all talked about the need for an increase in housing and how we can utilize certain methods to protect our environment and help with flood mitigation. So I'm just excited to see this moving forward and wanted to say thank you.
Okay. Jimmy.
Just real quick, I think it'll also be good for the public to understand what isn't going to be addressed by a land development code so that we can focus our conversations in April, and also what questions do we need to get right in April because we won't be able to unpack them once the draft is drafted. And that was one of my challenges with Code Next, is by the time we were handed a draft, it was too complex to go through and fix the parking issue or to fix compatibility because it was just threaded throughout the entire document. So things that I'm hearing from the public, certainly fees are not related to the land development code, what it costs to get a tap to the water system. The challenges of the permitting process, not directly related to the code, although the complexity kind of implies to that. The issue of deed restrictions, right? We can't undo these private contracts that are deed restrictions, and there's confusion in the community about that. Other questions about how we use city-owned lands and things that I think it'll be good for the public to know what parts of the code need, what policy decisions have to be decided up front, and what ones can we do at the end. What are the, is it a 10-day period? Is it a 40-day appeal? Like those things where you can go in and just change one number and it addresses a community's concern, as opposed to these heady. It's threaded through a whole document question. That way the public knows exactly what we're debating up front and what we can debate at the end.
And
Yeah, so first off, thank you, Councilmember Ellis. I think that's the way that we want to think about this as we go into it, because it is our chance to address, to address a lot of the problems that we've been dealing with. So I'm glad that we're getting to this point. I think that building off of what you said, Councilmember Flanagan, one of the things that I wanted to ask for that I think might relate to what you're saying is that I think it would be helpful for me to have a piece of paper, like a table or a document, that lists for me the additional issues outside of these 5, and the ones that we may think that we have consensus on, and the ones we may think require further conversation. Now, I realize that has some complexities to it, but I would ask that you think about that because it would certainly help us with identifying the other things that we're going to need to address. It might also surface, like what I think the goals document does. I think it might help us surface where we have consensus, might help us move faster on some things, and it might help us identify areas where we think we have consensus and we don't, or areas where we think we don't and we actually do. So I realize that may be a little bit complicated on how that's done, but I really would ask you to think about if you can provide us something like that. And then related to that then is I will have some more questions when we get down to the details. Is there a specific way to submit those, and is there a way to submit them so the public can see them? Have you all thought about that?
Councilmember, I know we were working on a portal similar to the budget Q&A, and I don't know if it's up and running, but it will be shortly. And so we'll alert both the council and the public when that's available for you to submit those type of questions to staff.
Allison.
I wanted to just second Councilmember Kitchen's request because I think that these 5 questions taken in context of some other things where we do have common ground, or if we don't have common ground, but I think we have common ground, would affect some of the choices that I would make. So, for instance, how we're moving forward with some of the drainage and environmental choices would affect how I'm thinking about the answers to the 5 that you've highlighted. But I'm going to need to have a sense of where folks are on some of those where I think we have consensus, but we haven't actually confirmed that. And I think that would be also important for the public as we're trying to push multiple goals through what has to be achieved through the land development code.
Paige.
I just, as the newcomer to this, just wanted to point out that, Council Member Harper Madison and myself are new to this process, and we're trying to have a new approach moving forward. And I just don't want to fall into a pattern of, because it was agreed upon a year ago, it's another year has gone by. We do have new council members, and we also deserve the opportunity to weigh in on these as well.
Okay. Anything else in this? Yes. Bill?
All I want to say is that I really want to thank you for this report here, the way you have it laid out, with the links. And I encourage anybody out there in the public to come online and take a look at it, because you also have all the links of all the ordinance and the reports. So really want to thank you and the staff for that.
Great.
Yeah.
We ready to move on, Greg?
To that same point, while I know that there are other issues outside of the 5 that you've laid out, and I think it's important, as Councilmember Flanagan and others have pointed out, to figure out if there is anything missing. I'm going to challenge myself, and I think you've challenged all of us, to really try to answer those 5 first, or to answer those 5 and then go from there, because I do think that that those are some of the core issues, certainly, that we discussed. I mean, you didn't pick those 5 for no reason, and so I appreciate you pressing us to really get into the weeds on those 5, and of course we need to figure out if there's anything beyond that you need to be able to draft something for.
Greg, would you launch us with the message board post? Dahlia?
just lost my train of thought. Oh, as far as the process, just for those of us, I'm assuming, who've said we want this done as quickly as possible, there are still the legal requirements that would, and this speaks to, I believe, what you were touching on, that there will be public hearings required, there will be first reading, second reading, all of that still applies. And correct, just want to make sure that the public is well aware that even though we're saying, let's get started on this, let's get going, there is still a timeline and framework that it has to be built into this process.
Absolutely. We're looking for the questions, of course, to be answered, and then we'll come forward with what that process will look like.
Okay. Anything else? Thank you very much. This is great work. I think you've launched this well here. Manager, thank you.